On December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years to the calendar, day after Michelle Martino's body was discovered in a parking lot, a 65-year-old man named Jerry Lynn Burns sat across from Detective Matt Denninger in his own office. Burns ran a computer coding business in Manchester, Iowa. He had no criminal record. He had never been to prison. By every outward measure, he was an ordinary business owner who'd lived quietly in a small town for nearly 4 decades. He had no idea he was about to learn that his presence on Earth had just become mathematically impossible to deny. Detective Denninger slid a photograph across the table. It was a dress. A black jersey dress, nearly 40 years old, preserved in an evidence locker since the winter of 1979. On that dress, in a place labeled Stain F5, was a DNA profile, a man's DNA. And when forensic analysts compared it to a sample extracted from a discarded drinking straw, collected covertly just days earlier from a Pizza Ranch restaurant in the same town, the mathematics became absolute. The probability that the DNA matched anyone other than the man sitting in that room was less than 1 in 100 billion. Burns denied it. He said he'd never been to Westdale Mall that night. He couldn't explain how his blood had ended up in a car he claimed he'd never seen. But Detective Denninger was watching his hands. Both of them were scarred. Deep, old scars across the palms and fingers. The kind of scars consistent with hands slipping down a blood-slicked knife handle during a violent struggle. The kind of scars a 1979 medical examiner had predicted would exist on the killer's hands, sitting untested and unconfirmed in an autopsy report for nearly 4 decades. Jerry Lynn Burns was arrested that same day for first-degree murder. But before we get to how that DNA ended up in an evidence locker for 39 years, before we understand how a Pizza Ranch straw solved what seemed unsolvable, we need to understand who it was he was accused of killing, and why this case became a test of what justice looks like when technology finally catches up to time. Michelle Martino was 18 years old on December 19, 1979. She was a senior at Cedar Rapids Kennedy High School in Iowa, a state where winter comes hard and freezes everything it touches. She was blonde, outgoing, and by the people who knew her, strikingly attractive. She twirled baton for her school's twirling squad and sang in the Kennedy Concert Choir, where she served as treasurer. To most of her classmates, she was the kind of girl who seemed comfortable anywhere, with people, with attention, with the normal social machinery of high school. But her older sister, Janelle, later described a slightly different picture underneath that resume. Michelle didn't have one best friend at school. Instead, she confided in her mother, Janet. Whatever was happening in her life, good or bad, her mother heard about it first. Even for well-liked teenagers, the social terrain of high school is more fraught than most adults remember. At one point, a group of female students had threatened Michelle over something as mundane as which building exit she used to leave school. It's a detail that matters, because it reminds us that every 18-year-old is still navigating invisible social friction most adults never see. But by December of 1979, Michelle's focus had shifted away from high school politics entirely. She'd been accepted to Iowa State University to study interior design. She'd gotten a job at the newly opened Westdale Mall. Her future was mapped out. She had a few more months of her senior year to get through, and then she could move forward into the life she'd already decided to live. She never got the chance. Here's what matters about how this case was investigated. The detectives who found Michelle's body in 1979 made a decision that they couldn't have possibly known would change everything. They preserved the evidence. In 1979, DNA as a forensic tool didn't exist. The polymerase chain reaction, the technology that makes DNA identification possible, was only theoretical. No court had ever admitted genetic evidence. The idea that a single stain on a dress could, 4 decades later, identify a killer with near-perfect certainty would have seemed like science fiction. Detective Harvey Denninger, who led the original investigation, didn't preserve Michelle's black jersey dress and the blood scrapings from the Buick's gearshift because he believed in a technology that didn't exist yet. He preserved them because that's what careful investigators do. They keep everything. They seal it. They log it. They store it properly, and they wait. They wait for better answers. This decision, this one choice made by detectives in 1979, is the reason this story doesn't end in a cold case file marked unsolvable. Most evidence from crimes decades old doesn't survive. It's stored improperly. It's contaminated. It's discarded to make room. Institutional memory fails. Chain of custody breaks. A single misstep by someone cleaning out evidence storage in 1985 or 1995, and the DNA that would eventually convict Jerry Lynn Burns disappears forever. And the case remains cold. Michelle Martino remains unidentified. Her family never gets answers. But this time, someone preserved it correctly, and 39 years later, when a technology emerged that no one in 1979 could have anticipated, it was waiting. If you follow cases like this one, you've probably noticed that many cold cases stay cold not because the investigator didn't care, but because the evidence was lost or degraded before science could catch up to it. Evidence preservation is invisible until it matters everything. If you're interested in how criminal investigations actually work, the decisions detectives make that ripple forward through decades, subscribe now. I'm covering cases where one decision in 1979 didn't just matter, it changed everything. It was 4 a.m. on December 20th when the patrol officer's flashlight caught the Buick Electra in the northeast parking lot of Westdale Mall. The car had been there for hours. Michelle hadn't come home. Her father had called it in at 2 a.m., and within an hour, officers were checking parking lots across Cedar Rapids. When they found her, she was slumped across the front passenger seat. What happened next mattered more than anyone investigating that night could have understood. When the Cedar Rapids Police Department secured the vehicle as a crime scene, they didn't rush. They photographed it from every angle before opening the doors. They documented the position of the body, the distribution of blood, the location of every visible piece of evidence. They called the medical examiner. They called the crime lab. When technicians arrived, they processed the interior methodically, collecting, photographing, cataloging, sealing. This is chain of custody. It's the documentary trail that proves evidence hasn't been contaminated, switched, or lost. It's the legal and practical foundation that allows something collected in 1979 to be used in court in 2020. And it only works if everyone in the chain does their part correctly. The Buick's interior told a story of extreme violence. Blood saturated the front bench seat. It spattered across the dashboard, the door trim, the gear shift lever. Clumps of white and brown fur from Michelle's rabbit fur coat lay scattered across the seat, torn loose during a struggle. But outside the car, on the exterior panels, on the asphalt surrounding it, there was nothing. No blood on the door handles. No footprints. No drag marks. No evidence that victim or attacker had ever stepped out onto the pavement during the attack. That absence meant something critical to the detectives processing the scene. The entire assault had happened inside the enclosed cabin of that car. In a well-lit suburban mall parking lot, with dozens of other vehicles nearby, and businesses still operating, something catastrophic had occurred in complete isolation, with no one outside seeing or hearing a thing. The post-mortem examination began the morning of December 20th. The medical examiner documented 29 separate sharp force wounds. Most were concentrated on Michelle's face, neck, and chest. Several had penetrated deep enough to reach her lungs. One wound, a deep puncture to her chest, had severed her aorta while her heart was still beating, causing massive internal hemorrhaging. That was the fatal injury. But it wasn't the only injury. It wasn't even close to the only injury. What the autopsy revealed next would sit dormant in a report for 39 years before its true significance emerged. Michelle had severe defensive wounds across both palms and fingers. Deep lacerations where she'd gripped the blade, where she'd fought back against the person attacking her. The medical examiner made an educated prediction based on the volume of blood at the scene and the nature of defensive wounds. As the weapon grew slick with blood during the struggle, the killer's hand would have slipped down the handle and onto the blade itself. The attacker had almost certainly cut his own fingers or palms in the process. It was a detail buried in a 1979 autopsy report, one line among dozens of clinical observations. No detective in that room could have known that 39 years later, those scars would be staring them in the face on a living man's hands. Robbery wasn't the motive. Michelle's purse was found intact. The $180 in cash she'd brought to finish paying off a winter coat sat untouched inside her wallet. There was no sexual assault. She remained fully clothed, and the medical examiner found no evidence of it. What investigators were left with was something more difficult to solve. A brutal personal attack with no obvious reason for it, no eyewitnesses to the actual violence, and, most critically, almost no physical evidence that could identify who had done it. Technicians recovered glove impressions in blood and dust, textured chevron pattern impressions on the steering wheel, gear shift, door handles, and light switch. The killer had worn rubber gloves throughout the entire encounter. He'd worn them while attacking. He'd worn them while operating the vehicle afterward. He'd removed them before leaving. Whoever did this had either planned carefully enough or panicked precisely enough to leave almost nothing behind. Almost. Detective Harvey Denninger led the original investigation. The Cedar Rapids Police Department deployed every tool available to them in 1979. They canvassed Westdale Mall. They interviewed hundreds of people. They visited Kennedy High School. They followed leads that seemed promising and leads that seemed absurd. They built a composite sketch from eyewitness accounts. A white male, late teens to early 20s, roughly 6 feet tall, with short to medium curly brown hair. That sketch generated hundreds of tips. After alibi checks, every single one led nowhere. Here's what mattered about 1979 forensic technology. It could categorize blood by type: A, B, AB, or O. Nothing more. Fingerprints required a suspect to compare against. Without a match, they were just whorls and ridges with no name attached. Fiber analysis could tell you a fabric came from a coat, but not which coat or who wore it. Serology could tell you something was human blood, but not whose. The glove impressions were useless without finding the gloves. The most reliable identification method available in 1979, fingerprints, was completely unavailable in this case because the killer had worn gloves. Over the following 2 decades, leads dried up. Original detectives retired. Files moved into cold case storage. Every December, local media ran anniversary pieces, hoping someone somewhere would remember something new. Nobody ever did. But the Cedar Rapids Police Department did one thing right. One institutional choice made in the depths of a case gone cold became the entire reason this story didn't end in a filing cabinet marked unsolved. They kept the evidence. All of it. They didn't throw it away to save space. They didn't lose it through neglect. They sealed Michelle's dress. They sealed the blood scrapings from the gear shift. They logged them. They stored them properly. They waited. Most cold cases don't get solved not because detectives didn't care, but because evidence was lost, contaminated, or destroyed before the science existed to use it. What you're about to see is how one 1979 decision to preserve evidence correctly set the stage for a 2018 breakthrough. But it took more than preservation. It took a technology that wouldn't exist for another 30 years, and a detective willing to think like a genealogist. Tell me in the comments, do you think police should have to get a warrant before using genealogy databases to solve cold cases? Or does the breakthrough justify the method? That question is about to matter more than you realize. In 2006, nearly 3 decades after Michelle Martino's murder, cold case investigators pulled her black jersey dress out of evidence storage. The garment had been sealed and logged for 27 years. They also retrieved the blood scrapings from the Buick's gear shift. Both items had been stored in controlled conditions, protected from contamination and degradation. It was time to see what modern science could extract from them. The Cedar Rapids Police Department sent everything to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation Crime Laboratory. This time, they weren't asking technicians to categorize blood type. They weren't looking for fingerprints. They were looking for something that had seemed impossible in 1979, a complete DNA profile. The lab isolated a single-source male DNA profile from a specific stain on the dress, designated stain F5. The results came back clean. A second sample from the gear shift scrapings revealed a mixture of profiles, but the same male DNA from stain F5 appeared as the major contributor. In other words, this wasn't contamination or coincidence. The same man's DNA had been found in 2 separate locations at the crime scene, on 2 separate pieces of evidence processed independently. CRPD uploaded that profile into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, in 2006. CODIS is a database of DNA profiles from individuals convicted of felonies serious enough to require genetic collection. It's a powerful tool. It's also limited. It only contains profiles from people already in the criminal justice system. The system came back empty. No matches. Nothing. It meant one thing. Whoever left that blood had never been arrested for a felony serious enough to warrant DNA collection. He wasn't in CODIS. He might never be in CODIS. The man who killed Michelle Martino, identified by a profile so specific it could only match 1 in 100 billion random people, was a ghost in the only database that could have caught him. So detectives did it the hard way. Over the following decade, investigators manually collected reference DNA swabs from more than 100 potential suspects, ex-boyfriends, men who'd been seen at the mall that night, individuals with histories of violence, suspects from other unsolved cases with similar patterns. They collected, they tested, they compared each profile against stain F5. 100 names, 100 negative results, 100 dead ends, each one a small disappointment in a long series of disappointments. The DNA profile sat in the lab, waiting for a name it wouldn't find. By 2015, the case had a new lead detective. Matt Denninger had grown up in Cedar Rapids. His father, Harvey Denninger, had been the original lead investigator in 1979. Matt was about to inherit his father's cold case, the same case his father had worked 4 decades earlier, and he was about to reach for a tool that didn't exist when his father first stood inside that blood-stained Buick. In 2017, with CODIS exhausted and manual suspect collection going nowhere, Detective Denninger contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based firm specializing in forensic DNA phenotyping. Parabon took the raw genetic data from stain F5 and used it to predict the physical characteristics of the man it belonged to. Their report described a Caucasian male of Northern European descent. Fair skin, blue eyes, blonde hair. Specific identifiable facial structure markers. It was a face built entirely out of biology. A predicted appearance constructed from nothing but chromosomes and probability. It was a start, but a predicted appearance still isn't a name. The next step required a different approach entirely. In 2018, CRPD authorized investigative genetic genealogy. Parabon uploaded the genetic profile to GEDeadmatch, a public database maintained by volunteers. Ordinary people submit their consumer DNA test results to GEDeadmatch to search for relatives, to find long-lost cousins, to fill in family trees. It was never designed for criminal investigation. It was designed for genealogy. But it contained millions of profiles, and it contained the answer. GEDmatch returned a partial familial match, a woman named Brandy Jennings living in Vancouver, Washington, someone with no known connection to Iowa, no established link to Michelle Martino, almost certainly no idea she was about to become a critical thread in a decades-old murder investigation. Detective Denninger then did something that sounds almost quaint for a case cracked open by cutting-edge genetics. He became a genealogist. He spent months in census records, birth registers, marriage certificates, and obituaries. He painstakingly reconstructed Brandy Jennings's family tree, going backward through 4 separate sets of great-great-grandparents. He traced branches that dead-ended. He followed lines that split and spread. Eventually, one branch led somewhere very specific, to an Iowa woman named Janice Burns. Janice Burns agreed to provide a DNA sample voluntarily to police. When the lab compared it against stain F5, something enormous emerged. The man who left blood at the 1979 crime scene was a close male relative of Janice Burns, specifically her first cousin. One genetic relationship, one familial match. And suddenly, 39 years of investigation, 100 cleared suspects, an entire genealogical tree, countless dead ends, collapsed down to 3 men. 3 brothers who grew up together in Manchester, Iowa. Donald Burns, Kenneth Burns, and Jerry Lynn Burns. One of these 3 men had killed Michelle Martino. Now, investigators just had to identify which one without tipping him off. Under Iowa law, Cedar Rapids detectives couldn't simply knock on doors and ask for DNA swabs. Not without probable cause. Not without risking evidence destruction or warning the very person they were looking for. So they turned to covert surveillance. Officers watched each brother in public until he unknowingly left something behind. Donald Burns discarded a plastic drinking straw. Officers collected it and tested it. The DNA didn't match stain F5. He wasn't their man. Kenneth Burns discarded a toothbrush. Officers collected it and tested it. Also not a match. That left one brother, Jerry Lynn Burns. Surveillance officers followed him and his adult son to a Pizza Ranch restaurant in Manchester, Iowa. They sat down in a nearby booth, just 2 more customers among dozens. They watched as Burns drank his soda through a clear plastic straw. When he finished his meal and left the restaurant, officers moved in, bagged the discarded cup and straw, and rushed it to the Iowa DCI crime laboratory. The saliva on that straw held a full male DNA profile. When the lab compared it against stain F5, the blood on Michelle Martino's dress, sitting in evidence storage for 39 years, it matched. Not consistent with, not similar to. A match with a probability of belonging to an unrelated random person calculated at less than 1 in 100 billion. Independent testing by a second laboratory confirmed the same profile matched the major contributor from the Buick's gearshift scrapings. 2 separate labs, 2 separate crime scene samples. 1 man, Jerry Lynn Burns. The method that solved this case, genetic genealogy, has cracked hundreds of cold cases since 2018. But it's also raising questions that courts are still working to answer. When police use your family's DNA data against you without a warrant, is that justice or invasion? The answer matters more than you think, and it's about to split the Iowa Supreme Court wide open. Subscribe to see how the courts actually ruled on this. On December 19, 2018, Detective Matt Denninger and his team walked into Advanced Coding Concepts, Jerry Lynn Burns's computer business in Manchester, Iowa. Burns was 65 years old, 25, living roughly an hour north of Cedar Rapids with no criminal record, no CODIS entry, and by every visible measure, no connection whatsoever to Michelle Martino. They sat down with him in his office for a non-custodial interview. The entire conversation was recorded on a camera, hidden inside a coffee mug. When Denninger told Burns that his DNA matched blood found on a murder victim's dress from 4 decades earlier, Burns denied everything. He said he'd never been to Westdale Mall that night. He couldn't explain how his blood had ended up in that car or on that dress. He offered no coherent account of his whereabouts in December 1979. But 2 things happened in that room that detectives couldn't ignore. First, unprompted, Burns brought up Jed Heisenturd, a TV news anchor who'd vanished without explanation from Mason City, Iowa in 1995, a name with no established connection to the Martino case at all. The mention went nowhere, but it surfaced something unsettling. Burns seemed to know details about crimes he shouldn't have known. Second, and more immediately damning, detectives could see the scars across both of Burns's hands and forearms. Old scars. Deep scars consistent with the kind of defensive wounds a person sustains when their hands slip down a blood-slicked knife handle during a violent struggle. They were the exact scars a 1979 medical examiner had predicted would exist on the killer's hands, a prediction sitting untested in an autopsy report for nearly 4 decades, now staring investigators directly in the face on a living man's own skin. Cedar Rapids police arrested Jerry Lynn Burns for first-degree murder that same day. The trial of State versus Jerry Lynn Burns began in February 2020 in Iowa District Court for Scott County in Davenport. The defense team, led by attorney Kathleen Zellner, filed motions before trial even began, attempting to keep key evidence away from the jury entirely. Their central argument, collecting Burns's DNA from an abandoned drinking straw without a warrant, amounted to an unconstitutional search under the Fourth Amendment. Judge Faye Hoover Grindy disagreed. Once Burns had walked away from that straw at Pizza Ranch, he'd abandoned it and any reasonable expectation of privacy in it. The ruling held. At trial, prosecutor Nick Maybanks built the state's case around one thing: mathematical certainty. Forensic analysts from the Iowa DCI lab and a second independent laboratory walked the jury through the DNA evidence in its staggering statistical improbability. Less than 1 in 100 billion. The dress, the gear shift scrapings, photographs of the glove impressions, documentation of Burns's scarred hands. All of it went before the jury. The defense didn't dispute the science. They couldn't. Instead, they argued that DNA proved contact, not intent. That it proved Burns had been inside that car at some point, but not necessarily at the moment of the murder. They pointed to the complete absence of any eyewitness placing him at Westdale Mall on December 19, 1979. They raised questions about chain of custody stretching back nearly 4 decades. They attacked the reliability of a jailhouse informant who claimed Burns had made incriminating statements. On February 24, 2020, after closing arguments, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Jerry Lynn Burns guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Grindy sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the mandatory penalty under Iowa law for that conviction. The case seemed closed, but Burns wasn't done fighting. Burns appealed his conviction to the Iowa Supreme Court, and State v. Burns became something bigger than one murder case. It became a test of exactly how far police can go when using a stranger's own genetic material against them. Burns's appeal centered on a fundamental question: does a person retain a right to privacy in their own DNA, even after they've discarded the physical object carrying it? His lawyers argued that human genetic material is not like ordinary trash. It carries deeply private biological information, not just about Burns, but about his entire genetic family. Extracting and analyzing that DNA without a warrant, they contended, violated the Fourth Amendment. On March 31, 2023, the Iowa Supreme Court ruled. The decision was close, 5-2. The majority, in an opinion written by Justice Matthew May, sided with the state. They held that under long-established Fourth Amendment law, a person has no reasonable expectation of privacy in something voluntarily abandoned in a public place. Once Burns walked out of Pizza Ranch, he surrendered any privacy claim to what he'd left on that table. The court also emphasized that the DNA analysis performed was narrowly limited to comparing identity markers. It wasn't probing his private medical history or broader genetic makeup. But Justices Matthew McDermott and Dana Oxley dissented, and their argument deserves serious consideration. They contended that human DNA is fundamentally different from ordinary trash. It carries intimate biological information, not just about an individual, but about their entire genetic family. In their view, covertly collecting and analyzing DNA should require a warrant grounded in probable cause, regardless of where the physical sample was found. They were arguing for what some legal scholars call genetic exceptionalism, the idea that DNA is so uniquely personal that it deserves heightened legal protection. The dissent didn't carry the day. Burns took the fight one step further, petitioning the United States Supreme Court for review in August 2023. That petition was denied. The Iowa ruling stood. Jerry Lynn Burns remains incarcerated at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison, serving his life sentence with no possibility of parole, ever. For Michelle Martino's parents, Albert and Janet, the wait for answers never actually ended. Both of them died before 2018, before genetic genealogy led investigators to the Burns family. They spent decades cooperating with police, hoping and ultimately not getting the resolution they needed most. Neither parent lived to learn who had killed their daughter. Neither parent lived to see an arrest, a trial, or a conviction. It fell to Michelle's sister, Janelle Stonereeker, and her husband John, to represent the family through the prosecution and appeals their parents never witnessed. At Burns's sentencing in August 2020, John Stonereeker delivered a victim impact statement that captured something no verdict could fully repair. That while the legal system had finally delivered accountability, the grief Michelle's parents carried to their graves was permanent. Justice had arrived. It had simply arrived decades too late for the two people who needed it most. The Martino case is now studied as a landmark example of what investigative genetic genealogy can accomplish when traditional forensics run out of answers. It shows how a single stain preserved correctly for 4 decades can eventually unravel through a public genealogy database never designed for criminal investigations. It shows how a father and son, separated by 36 years, can each play their part in solving the same unfinished case. But it also shows us something harder to resolve. The courts are still actively working out the rules for a technology that didn't exist when Michelle Martino died. Rules about what privacy means when the evidence is your own DNA, left behind without you ever realizing it would become the key to identifying you. Michelle Martino never got to walk into Iowa State University. She never got to use that winter coat she was paying off in layaway. But the case that carried her name became one of the reasons law enforcement across the country now looks at genetic genealogy not as a novelty, but as one of the most powerful tools available for solving cases everyone else had given up on. If you want to see how far genetic genealogy has actually gone, and the cases where suspects fought it all the way to the highest courts, subscribe now. The next case I'm breaking down was solved using the exact same method, but the legal battle went places State v. Burns never did.